Want to wait for you? Kayla?
Well, we should, because we're also having Jeffrey joined by Zoom, right?
Right, exactly. Good morning, Emery.
Good morning.
We just kind of start. We don't even think about good morning. We just start.
Still morning.
Okay, I understand. Uh-huh.
Yes.
There he is. Good.
Okay. You're good, Carolyn.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. It's nice to see that we have a nice group out here. I appreciate it. Just to bring you up to snuff where we left off last time, we reviewed the charge of the committee. And I think what I'll do is maybe go over it again so everybody's on the same sheet of music. We had 4 of them. It was possible zoning options to help management with the short-term rentals. It was a possible need for additional regulations to manage the short-term rentals. It was a possible need to differentiate the GRRT for short-term rentals versus the long-term rentals. And it was a possible need to revise the licensing fees and requirements for short-term rental. We talked about future dates of our meeting. We said every 2 weeks would be a good time, but I'll go after the dates when we finish at the end of the meeting. The objective here is to do recommendations to the mayor and city council after we finish all our research. So to bring you up to date on where we are, you received an email from me and it says, I don't know if you had a chance to look at it. I hope you did. Did you? Perfect. Okay. And what I asked in there is that I know we've set out what the objectives were for the committee, but I'd like to have a kind of an idea of what you feel your goal is so that I feel like I'm touching on that too. So if you're comfortable, I'd like you to just kind of talk to me about how you perceive your goal as this committee. And whoever wants to start first is good to me. And if you're shy then and you don't want to, that's perfectly fine too, because I can keep talking.
I'll start.
All righty.
I like to see a win-win-win outcome so that residents, the businesses, and the owners of the Airbnbs all benefit from this outcome. My concern is around the quality of life issues. Our neighborhood's been affected by the excessive amount of cars staying at some of the Airbnbs and the parking in front of our house. We've had noise issues. There's been concerns. I mean, on a bigger picture, there's concern about housing shortages for, we had a neighbor that was renting a house year round and they had to move out because the place became an Airbnb. They couldn't afford to stay there anymore. I mean, the bigger picture is there's no workforce housing in Lewis. So that's a concern. I guess also the bigger picture is I'm concerned about how the town is shifting. But I like to work towards finding a balance between the benefits for the homeowners, but also for the residents.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Tanya?
Sure. Tanya Flickinger, 903 Cedar Street, or my husband and I own 903 Cedar Street on the beach side of Lewis. We are property owners. We are short-term rental owners as well. We rent our home. We're neighbors, and we like to consider ourselves a member of the community. So when I was asked to serve on the committee, I was happy to do it. I plan to have a very open mind. I would love to understand concerns that are out there about short-term rentals. And would like to give the perspective of an owner, but by no means am I coming into this as, sort of one-sided from an owner perspective, because as I, first stated, we're neighbors, we're members of the community, and we want to see this community in Lewis thrive in the long term. So although I don't have any particular goals besides just wanting to serve the broader community. So my plan is to listen first and then try to help.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Winnie, what do you think?
107 Kings Highway and disclosing the old buttery as part of our family. So I guess my biggest concerns are we have looking out into the future and thinking about financials and knowing that we have not gotten to the tough side of what's happening. Possibly a big recession. I want to put it on the table that at all costs, the town is the most important, trying to stay alive during a hardship that could come in the next 17 months. So that I would like to be part of the discussion. And then the other side is we had started to touch on possibly, dissecting the town and which part could be rentals, short-term rentals. I think that really needs to be heard from all voices in town. I think that rentals should be monitored by parking. I've come across it in another area, Pennsylvania, and parking is a huge thing for Lewis. We don't have enough of it. And I think that should become part of the package of listening to people speak about short-term rentals and parking. I think that is a huge thing. But outside of that is I do want to listen. I want to listen to everyone's opinions and voices, and hopefully we can make it work between short-term rentals, long-term rentals, and commercial in town.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Okay, that brings us right to where I wanted to go, which is we left this last meeting and we were talking about we needed to get information as it related to other towns and what they're doing and what have you. In that period of time, Ellen Lorraine and I and Anne-Marie met with a gentleman who, if you have your packet that I gave you, gives you a pretty good idea of what his skills are as it relates to short-term rentals. For those of you who don't have it, I don't have it on the screen, but it's a company that deals strictly with regular tools for short-term rentals, and they've dealt with different states. I can't remember some of the states. One was New York, another was Jeffrey. What was the company's dates that you worked with so far, if you don't mind?
I've worked with probably 100 communities across the country and into Canada, including in New Jersey, in Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, Vermont, British Columbia, cities like Los Angeles and Denver and Vancouver, very large cities, but also very tiny cities, Mandeville, Louisiana, places that are, even smaller than Lewis. So all sorts of different communities around the country. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. So with that in mind, when we left it, trying to get more information about all of this, we got in touch with Jeffrey and asked him to talk to us. Ellen Lorraine and Anne-Marie and I talked with him quite extensively and recognized that the possibility has the skills that we need to sort of take us step by step from where we need to go. And at the end, hopefully be able to have something to present to the mayor and city council as it relates to next steps. So I'm not going to turn everything over to Jeffrey, but by the same token, I would also like you to get to know him, to hear what he has to offer us. And so I'm going to give you the floor, Jeffrey, so that you can take it from there.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you say that because I will talk forever. So you always need to come get me. My name is Jeffrey Goodman. I'm an urban planner. I've worked on this issue now for 7 or 8 years. I live in New Orleans, Louisiana, which is a slightly different place than yours, although I think also pretty hot. I grew up in Huntington Beach, California, so I'm very well acquainted with the beach town vibe. And this is a very complicated issue, and it's not one where you can take a kind of boilerplate approach. Even other communities around you, even similar size communities, you can't really take their ordinance and cross their name out and write yours in. You have a very specific context, and I think you have some very specific goals, and those are really good to hear that you are starting with that question of what is the goal? What do we want to see? What do we think some of the issues are? And good regulations not only need to be enforceable, they do need to reflect the local values and the local context. And so it can be sometimes a little fraught, but it's important to work through what those values are, what the goals are, and to hear from a lot of different types of people. This intersects with people's businesses and with people's homes and neighborhoods. Not surprisingly, I would say the community tends to get pretty fired up about it. But within all of that, there's a lot of important details that you can get, very specific things, very nuanced things that'll lead you to an ordinance or a system that's going to work for you this year, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, because it'll be reflective of the unique qualities of your town. And I never want to be someone who just jetpacks in, tells you what to do, and jetpacks away. I think whatever is developed, I can help with, but it's going to ultimately come from the people of the town and what their views are and what their goals are. And I can assist that. But ultimately, I think it's up to you all to really develop what those are, and then we can help sort of translate that into a legal document.
Emery, you got any questions for Jeffrey? On Lorraine? No. Okay, Jeffrey, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Who is that?
It's Coyle.
Oh, right. Thanks. Hi, Claire. Oh, I don't see you, but I hear you. Go ahead, Cleo.
Thank you, Carolyn. Jeffrey, thank you very much. I read your packet over the weekend, and certainly you have a lot of extensive experience in a variety of communities, which is terrific. One quick question. We talked about this at our last meeting. Is it been commonplace, or do you have experience in working with different cities in which certain areas of the city are governed by one set of short-term rental regs, whereas another part has different regs? And the reason I bring that up is one of the things that we talked about last time is the community, the Lewis Beach community in our community has a lot of short-term rentals, but parking generally has not been seen as a problem there. They have big driveways. They're able to accommodate cars, whereas in our downtown community, which is denser, there are problems with people who rent units, and instead of 2 cars coming to visit, there's 8 cars parked on our streets, which really makes it difficult for their full-time residents to find off-street parking. Can you talk just a second about that in terms of your background?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, there are a million ways to slice this issue, and a pretty, I would say, not uncommon one is, especially in a place that has some very distinct geographic difference. So, we've worked with communities, say in Colorado, where there's the area near the ski mountain and then the rest of the town. I just wrapped up a project in Grays Harbor County, Washington, which is also on the coast. And they have all these coastal properties, beautiful Washington state coast, and then the rest of the county, which is agricultural and rural. So it's not uncommon for places to make some sort of distinction geographically. Sometimes that's tied to zoning, sometimes that's an overlay, sometimes that's just an arbitrary, feet. It's 1,000 feet from this, from the Rose Bowl or whatever. It's going to have different rules. Ultimately, the goal of that is to reflect local reality, right? And we recognize that there's a lot of different things going on, even in a fairly small town. And so, when we get to that sort of stage, I think we can talk about, how best to reflect those realities and those expectations. But it's certainly something that happens quite a bit in a place that has kind of a very obvious geographic issue. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, you triggered that thought because when you mentioned boilerplate ordinances, that you just cross that. And we talked about this last time about, I don't think anyone thinks a one size fits all approach would work for Lewis. So that just triggered that. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you. Winnie, you and I talked before the meeting and you were discussing some issues that you thought were pertinent to talking to Jeffrey about. So I'm going to let you do that now.
Just the quick question. I mean, you did address some of the parking issues and I do know that being Lewis has like the historical district and then we have the beachfront and we do have larger homes on the beachfront.
Mhm.
I guess what the concerns are, I think, have you tackled where we have such a small amount of year-round residents?
Mhm.
And then the bust of summer season comes. And we want to take care of our residents that are full-time.
Mhm.
I guess my quick question is, I do know for rentals and commercial downtown, the rentals go hand in hand for commercial business.
Mhm.
So I think my biggest concern is the historical side of the town, limited parking, and making sure that the short-term rentals are still available, but with regulations for the historical side. As long as, and also saying the beach side too. We've addressed little bits and pieces for Lewis in the years past, on just throwing big venues on the beaches and stuff, and we calmed that down. But I think my biggest concern is the hand in hand. I think we do need to have everyone's voice, and I wanted to hear your opinion, how it would handle for long-term residents versus that big bust and pop for the summer.
Yeah.
Well, that's where I'm heading, to make sure our commercial still stands without, because we don't have that many commercial spaces in Lewis. And I have spoken to commercial people that have been here long before me. And when we had the crash, they barely made it.
Yeah.
They made it because housing crashed. And
Yeah.
I'm worried about housing slipping away from us with big rules and regs.
Yeah, I think it's a really, really common concern. And it's also a really common, almost existential question, I think, for a lot of communities about, do we want to always ride tourism exclusively, even in specific neighborhoods? Or do we want to try to smooth that out? Do we want to limit it to certain times of the year or certain zones? There's a lot of debate. There's a lot of actually really good academic research about, doing a kind of cost benefit between full-time tenants and tourists. And tourists spend their money in a certain way, and they spend their money at a certain time, and it supports certain types of businesses. Long-term tenants support a different range of businesses, but also often require more services than someone who's only there for 2 weeks. And I think in a historic district, especially, you do get this very large disparity between the amount of money you can make from long-term renting or from short-term renting versus long-term renting, and that can put a lot of pressure on housing. And even if that is only for basically the summer and maybe a little bit of the shoulder seasons, can really drive housing for the whole year. And so it's a complicated question, and you have a lot of different ways you can get at whatever it is the goal is. We work with communities that said, our goal is tourism. Our goal is to just maximize that amount of dollars because we think that'll fund or support small businesses downtown because we'll bring in more people than our town has. Other places said, we're starting to, look at weaning ourselves away from that or using that to supplement something else, or we're concerned about our high school. Schools become this big thing. We're really concerned that the lack of ability for younger people to move to town imperils the school enrollment, right? So it's a difficult one. And that's why I think some of those goals are very, important to articulate, to say, what is this community? What do we want this community to look like in 5 years, whether there's a recession or not? There probably is. And how do we make sure that our our regulation of short-term rentals, which is only a small part of the housing market, fits into a kind of grander strategy about what this town looks like.
So my
Is that-
last question, thank you for answering that. My last question, knowing that every town on the seashore from Cape May, Lewis, Bethany, whatever, they always have weekend events. We're trying to grow our town, fall festivals and beer festivals and people come into this small little town and we're very limited on hotels. So this is a question about short-term rentals. We want our town to flourish with our little festivals on weekends. And we want people to say, okay, well, you can rent the house from Friday to Monday or Friday to Sunday. That is another question that I worry, how do we control short-term rentals, but really know that our town is still wanting to grow on weekends, because that's how Rehoboth, I don't know if you're familiar with Rehoboth, but they started off very slow in the late 80s and 90s and worked their way up, that every weekend has something that's happening. And I see that Lewis is starting to do a little bit of the weekend extravaganzas, as I would say. That is a big thing for short-term rentals, because people want to come in and do the fall festivals or whatever we have happening in Lewis. That's a question if
It's just a matter of control of that.
yeah, controlling that.
Yeah, I mean, some of it depends on the nature of the short-term rental, right? So lots of places, I'll give you an example very close to home, New Orleans. There's a lot of regulations that we have that are related basically to people who live in their own home. It's their primary residence, but they want to make a bunch of money at Mardi Gras. So they leave for 2 weeks around Mardi Gras and make a ton of money, and then come back and live here the rest of the year, right? So that the way that is structured is about primary residency. So you don't have that issue of losing housing. You don't have that kind of speculation in the housing market, but it still allows people who live in town to benefit from the interest of people who want to come in and see the town. There are other ways you can control that, but again, you can control that so that you don't lose housing. You can control that so that you don't have noise complaints. You can control that so that you encourage more short-term rentals. You can go in a lot of different directions. I think it depends on what the outcome you're solving for is, and maybe that's even different in different parts of town. I mean, I think there there are different issues about where these festivals are having. Do you want to encourage more sort of tourism and lodging around where that's going to happen, or do you want to say actually this is an opportunity for the whole town? Or you have a lot of different things. The hyper specific ways, like I think Philadelphia did when the Pope visited, which is say we're going to allow short-term rentals from Thursday to Tuesday while the Pope is in town, and then never again, right? You can take it that fine. I don't recommend that necessarily, but you can. But again, I think it's and I think I've mentioned this to you in other meetings. You almost need a kind of, I say goal, but it's almost more of a filter in order to say, how are we choosing the interventions and making sure that they are all pulling together and all trying to solve the same problem. And I think this is why this can be a very difficult topic, is you can go in every possible direction and you might get very, very different outcomes, and you just have to decide which is really the outcome that you want. And I think, those festivals are interesting opportunities to sort of think about, what are you protecting? What are you trying to encourage? The other thing, which is I know beyond the mandate of this committee, is to look at lodging regulations and what is a bed and breakfast in the 21st century. I think is a question a lot of towns are asking, because often their bed and breakfast ordinance was written in 1960 or something. And that is always a little bit of a relief valve to some of these discussions, is to say, we have desire for lodging. Maybe we need not just maybe a geographic difference because of, of parking or the types of homes, but also maybe there's some other lane we can draw that says this is more about residents, this is slightly more commercial. And that may be a short-term rental, that might be a new bed and breakfast, that might be something else entirely. Not to give you more work or more things to think about, but it is something that I'm seeing a little bit more of, is this question of what is the next step up commercial from a short-term rental, because a short-term rental can be someone renting out their couch, or it could be a mansion that no one lives in.
I was
right?
wondering, short-term rental it's no specific definition for it, is it?
It's just time. It's just, usually it's under a month rental, but that's for money that you publicly advertise, right? So, that could be a couch that you rent out one day a year. That could be
Some of the places that you've
something
worked,
else.
have any of them been historic to the extent that you've looked at short-term rental as it relates to the historic district and restrictions?
Yeah, so Mandeville, Louisiana, which is just across the lake from us, very small town, very beautiful town, has this lovely historic district when it was a resort town from New Orleans. And they were very concerned about alterations. So they were very concerned about preserving the look of these historic homes, and especially about how that relates to parking. There's a lot of beautiful lawns and beautiful trees. They didn't want anyone trying to get more people into these homes by paving over part of their lawn to accommodate more cars. And so they actually ended up with a fairly complicated process that is a conditional use process for some of their historic district, because they wanted that extra level of control around the specifics of those properties, in the same way that I have a historic district and land use commission here in my home, in my neighborhood. They wanted that extra level of protection about the physical shape of some of these properties, the interiors of them even, to make sure that people were not going crazy trying to get some maximum number of people in, or building things that weren't permitted, or paving over historic lawns and all these other things. So yeah, it's very common. And that's also where sometimes you do end up folding into almost a commercial standard, because you're already asking them to jump through a lot of, applicants to jump through a lot of hoops. You basically have invented the same sort of commercial process, right?
Questions on this end? Hold on for a minute, Jeffrey.
Sure.
Dawn, how about you? Do you have anything you want to ask him about? Because I see you writing, and so that tells me
Yeah,
your thoughts apply it.
Question would be, are you referring to sort of licensing and a permit requirement for a short-term rental?
Yeah, that's pretty standard these days, is to require some sort of, and it can vary even state to state because of what state laws say you have to call it. Sometimes it's a license, sometimes it's a permit, sometimes it's a notice or whatever. But yeah, to require I'll say a permit, because I'm comfortable with that, a permit, and that permit usually has some baseline operational standards to it. So fire safety, following your building codes, requirements about parking, requirements about trash, requirements about having a local contact person, whether it's the owner or not, to respond if there are, quality of life issues. You agree to pay your taxes, you agree to all these things. And those are becoming, I said things weren't that boilerplate, but those are becoming pretty standard in terms of, you have to have smoke detectors. You have to, have a pretty basic professionalization of what you're doing. The real sizzle, I guess, is around the kind of who, what, when, where, why question of, where is a short-term rental going to be? What is it? How big is it? Who operates it? Do they live there? All those questions. That's really the side where there's a lot more to discuss. The operational side, which is spelled out in a permit, is going to be really just making sure that people are operating for the health and safety of neighbors and guests.
That's the easiest part of it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I don't, excuse me, I don't think properties currently that are Airbnbs are under those requirements, as far as I know, fire, safety, insurance, that type of thing.
All right, let's find out.
We don't have, again, the only rental regulations we have are a rental license and a gross receipts rental tax. So we do not have any specifics for short-term rentals. Now, in terms of fire safety, if something gets into the category of being a B&B, and that's defined in the zoning ordinance, there's, I think, a special exception process for that. I think it's special exception. It might be conditional use, and that does include needing to comply with the fire safety. So I think whatever we come up with, we will have to look at what are the state fire prevention regulations to see if it does trigger a different category. Any standalone single-family home being rented is not going to trigger any type of fire plan review. But once you get into where you're doing a portion of the house, it could, depending on how far you go in that.
Yeah, I think the current zoning requires a B&B to have a special exception, whether it's in a residential zone or even a commercial zone.
I know it does in a residential
General
zone.
commercial or marine commercial, I believe.
Yes, and then beyond that, so the zoning ordinance defines a B&B, and I think it's 5 or fewer rooms. And then if you exceed 5 rooms, you're in a different category where you can't have a B&B with, say, 7 rooms. That would put you in as more as an inn. Board. Okay.
Boarding house.
Okay.
We still have 1930s. A few spots.
So, no, it's fine.
Yeah, that's one of my concerns and wants would be that short-term rentals have a conditional use or special exception for whatever zone they're in. And that I also would like to see a differentiation between owner-occupied home sharing versus a property that's owned and rented out with an off-site property owner.
So this is also an important vocabulary point, and I think we talked about this in a previous meeting, which is there's home sharing and there is primary residence, and there's not these things. And so it's important to be clear that home sharing often refers to someone renting out a portion of their residence, their primary residence, while they are present, versus if I have a primary residence and I go to Acapulco and I rent out my place for 2 weeks, that is still a primary residence. So you're not losing any housing units to short-term renting, but I'm not present as the host. I'm somewhere else. And those are advertised differently on Airbnb or on VRBO. And they have different implications about enforcement. They have different implications often about some of the impacts in the community. So just to make sure that we're speaking on the same page, there are those slight nuances which can be confusing, I think, sometimes as we talk about them. So just a thing to keep in mind.
Quick question. You ever come across, this is Winnie Key, come across where people have rented for, let's say, a week or Airbnb short term, and then they rent out rooms? Yeah,
Really?
that's another thing that I'm hearing, where Jane Doe rents the whole house for $15,000, and then she starts renting a room to be at the beach for $800. You can rent the room for $8. Have you seen that?
I hear about that. People.
Wow.
Sometimes that's less. I mean, sometimes it's a little shocking. Sometimes it's a little less nefarious, where someone will have a month-long beach rental and they're only going to be there 2 weeks, and then they try to kind of sublet it.
Yeah.
This is one of those reasons why you have a permitting system, right? And can make sure that everyone who is advertising on one of those listing sites has a valid permit and is the permit holder. Obviously, if you're the homeowner, you have tremendous incentive to try to prevent that. But yeah, I would say that that's one of those things that can be made a lot more difficult, if not impossible, by having, say, you have to put your permit number at the top of your advertisement. And, we would be able to flag things that don't have permits. Now, are there ways to get around that? Of course, there's always some sort of will to do it, but that's then inviting, a lawsuit basically from the homeowner. Again, this is the kind of the professionalization of hosting, is you want to make sure that those hosts have protections for themselves, whether that's insurance or whether that's a kind of standard agreement between them and their guests about how they're supposed to operate and how they're supposed to be good neighbors. So some of that can be solved with those types of protections. There's always a way for someone to act the fool, but you can build in some of the circuit breakers to make it harder for them to do some of those sorts of things. What is becoming very standard, though, I would say, is that permits and really the land use of short-term renting really only falls on the homeowner. There were some places that tried to allow renters to get permits, and it just doesn't work, either because there's just not enough skin in the game, and renters I was a terrible renter when I was a youth, tend to be a little harder to pin down. Or honestly, a lot of times landlords just realize, why would I have this kind of intermediary when I can just do full-time short-term renting? So I think there are ways to try to make that more difficult or impossible, basically.
Thank you.
Carolyn, can I jump in for a second?
Sure, of course.
Yep. I just have two questions. One, this is kind of more directed towards Anne Marie and staff. After reading Jeffrey's information over the weekend, it dawned on me there was a lot of emphasis on business licensing, the licensing process, and what that entails, insurance, other things, and including that licensing number on the advertisement as well is a terrific way to kind of track compliance. Anne-Marie, currently, do we have anything in the business licensing piece of this? Is that some area we need to work on? We need to add more categories where hosts need to provide more information, or are you pretty comfortable currently with the licensing process?
No, I definitely think that as a result of this, we will have stronger licensing requirements. I do like the idea of requiring that the license number be part of the listing, because it does make it easier to verify compliance. We currently, I don't think, and you can tell me I'm wrong, we have not required proof of insurance for rentals. So I do think that there are a number of areas we could, kind of up the game a little bit to be a little more professional in how we handle these things.
Right.
So.
And currently, with regards to licensing, is the license currently $83?
Yeah, so we have only a rental license. So if you are renting, on a short-term basis, or if you have a tenant who is there, has been there for 20 years, you're paying the same licensing fee. So I know that is one thing that in our discussions with hosts a year or more ago, they had suggested that we should have a differential rate for the short-term rentals than the long-term rentals, especially when you look at things like workforce housing and affordable housing goals. It makes sense.
And I also noticed in Jeffrey's writings that I think the average, based on all the various communities, it usually seems like that's a little bit low, $83, because I thought it was between $250 and $500 were the licensing fees that Jeffrey had mentioned. So yeah, it seems like
for short-term renting, if you have a long-term rental program, that's a different.
That's a difference. And that leads me to my next question. You mentioned different, and this is more for you, Jeffrey. You mentioned more towards, the differentiation between home sharing and other short-term rentals, and and short-term versus long-term.
Mhm.
Are there, in your experience, how does the taxation generally work?
Yeah, so sometimes this is handled at the state level, right? Which is the platforms have struck deals with the state to collect, say, a hotel tax or a sales tax.
Right.
And then that filters back down, right? So that's handled one way. Sometimes local governments can impose other types of taxes or fees. Some of those are just kind of generic hotel fees or taxes per stay. Sometimes those are dedicated specifically to, say, affordable housing. That's becoming a common tool where it's 1% of short-term rental rates go to affordable housing in town. Okay. The real movement we've seen in the last couple of years in terms of taxation is actually at the land use level, and it depends on your assessor. So we've seen some assessors, and again, this is often guided by state law, assess short-term rentals differently than long-term rentals, and say that the income potential of a short-term rental property means that it's more valuable. And that's especially true in places that have stricter controls over permitting. If you go through a conditional use process and you get a permit, you're probably in it for the long haul. And we've had assessors say, I'm not going to consider this in the same way as a normal single family long-term house. We've also seen that with anywhere where there's a lot of housing being flipped, I guess, or just bought and sold to be short-term rentals. Sometimes that can have negative effects on long-term homeowners or long-term renters around it, because the assessor will say, I'm going to use the comparables for your neighborhood, and these are the 5 homes that sold. Well, they're all sold to become short-term rentals. They're almost in a different market, but to the assessor, they don't care. And so they say, your house is now worth all this much more because the 5 homes that just sold in your neighborhood sold for 20% more than they honestly are valued if they were for a homeowner. And now you have people getting higher tax bills because of homes that became short-term rentals in their neighborhood that they maybe don't even like. So we've seen some interesting things from the assessor side in terms of how they deal with this issue. And it is a gray area sometimes between residential and commercial, and they have to make a choice as to how much they want to get specific about some of those properties. And so that side of things is not often thought of until pretty late in the process, which is why I'm mentioning it here. And to get a sense of maybe what the assessor or some of those property tax changes might be based off of any potential ordinance is going to have a big effect over a lot of different people.
Thank you very much, Jeffrey. That's helpful.
Well, you've been a little quiet over this one. I see you writing.
That's one I had not thought about, and thinking
Yeah,
about
me
possible
either.
ways to tackle this. I hadn't thought about that one. I would say that's going to be more discussion for later.
Oh, absolutely. He's quite a plate here to get into.
I
Go
don't
ahead.
anticipate that we would assess from a tax perspective, short-term rental as you would do a commercial property where it would be income-based, because
Mhm.
It could change.
So
it could-
You're-
right, it
You're
could
not
change,
assessing that off.
and it's
Yeah.
not zoned commercial,
Yeah.
and I think that becomes it, but I think that's part of the reason that, having a gross receipts rental tax helps to kind of level that field where, it is an income producing property, but it's still taxed as a residential. The GRRT helps to kind of balance that.
Yeah, and that's a little unique. Not that many cities in America have that type of tax, which does put you in a little bit of a unique category in that you do have some sense of what is going on in those rental properties. Most cities in America, they have no clue about what is being used for what, and so they end up actually falling back on their assessor to make some of those decisions, which can lead to some wacky outcomes, I guess, for people because they're not operating with a lot of information. Yeah.
So I have a question. So the gross receipts and the income that is given to Lewis, is that
Mhm.
low? What, I don't know the amount.
So the city has, and this is for all rentals, whether
Yes.
it's short-term or long-term, is 5% of your
5%.
gross receipts.
And does that, in your opinion, do you see that the 5% is something that is covering costs for trash and the water on that type of stuff?
I think it's hard to say, well, water, they pay their utility bill through BPW. I
Right.
think it's hard to say because, we do have a second trash collection
Okay.
every year,
Summer.
during the summer months, which obviously that there's staff, equipment, gas costs, tipping fees, all that. And, if we didn't have the short-term rentals in the tourism economy, we wouldn't need that. Because we even had a conversation several years ago about potentially not providing the second pickup in the side of the community that has fewer
Right.
Mm-hmm. rentals, because what our guys are finding out is a lot of times people just don't even put it out, or if they do put it out, it's it's not, it's almost empty. The other thing, you think about what are the costs of the summer tourism. We spend a lot of time, and again, we haven't quantified it because it's all the maintenance staff that do it, but grooming the beach, emptying trash associated with the beach. And so where it's day trips, we have parking fees that pay for that. You feed the meter.
Right.
So the tax for the short-term rentals, I think, helps to offset
Correct.
that as
Yeah.
well. So we haven't quantified, exactly how much, what the return on investment is. But, I do think that through that tax and through the parking fees, it helps to
Right.
Offset.
offset the cost that the city incurs for the tourism that happens mostly during the summer.
So adjusting fees sounds like we need to discuss.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh, I think it's
Yeah.
definitely part of
Yeah,
this.
adjusting fees, yeah.
And one of the things that was brought up by some former members of council when they were on council was whether or not the gross receipts rental tax should be the same rate for short-term versus long-term.
Mhm.
And I think I'm kind of two minds there, because 5% of whatever it is on your long-term
It's-
is, so since it's a percent, if you're renting for $1,000 a month versus $1,000 a week, 5% is going to be 5%. So you're going to bring in more
That's right.
based on the $1,000 a week than you would for the $1,000 a month. So, I think, but then the flip side of it is if you do want to kind of incentivize the long-term rentals, having a lower rate
Having
can
them
do
have
that.
the
So it
lower
really becomes
percent.
a policy discussion on, what are the objectives?
Anne Marie, one thing that I know you don't have these numbers off the top of your head, but to bring into a future meeting, I think it would be important for us is to see what the 2021 revenues were from that tax. And then if there's any way to possibly break that down, I know I fill it out myself, so you don't ask me if I'm a short-term or a long-term renter, but I think you do ask me for number of days rented. If I remember that right, I think you do get number of
Believe
days.
so.
Yes, and we do, there is a questionnaire that asks if you rent short-term or long-term, but what we found is most people don't even fill that out.
Mm.
No.
Okay.
The other thing, and as you know, it's all honor system.
Yes.
And that's always a challenge. Now that we've been using host compliance, they do look at the online platforms. So with that, they're able to track the the confirmed nights versus, what it was advertised for. And they provide us with, for each rental, what they're, and again, these are on the online platform, so it wouldn't necessarily count something that's done through a realtor. What the anticipated revenue based on what they've been able to verify should be. So if they come up with, we should have gotten $2,000 and somebody submits
Yeah.
500, we can say,
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
Right.
the honor
Yeah.
system's tough.
yeah, the honor system is
It's
tough, but
tough.
we don't currently have, and of course, the honor system,
I mean, I like the realtor side because they document everything.
right.
Mhm.
And
That's becoming a requirement for in ordinances for short-term rentals, is that they have to maintain records. Again, this is kind of this professionalization piece of it, that they have to maintain records, whatever records you want for, 2 years or 3 years. And that you have the right to audit that. Now, whether you actually take that right and do audit some things, that's up to you. We have seen some places, this is true also with, say, fire inspections, where you pull 5% or 10% of the responses and you do those audits and you see what the failure rate is, right? So you might be able to do, we're going to take 10% randomly out of this pile of people who said they earned income, and we want to do an audit. And if 10 of those people pass, then great. If 2 of those people pass and 8 of them were fudging it, maybe that tells you you need a slightly different system. So we've seen a lot of places use that kind of threat, I guess, as a way to make sure that people, think twice before they totally fudge it in their reporting.
So Adrian, you guys hold back, you submit on behalf of the people who you manage for, right? And I think there are some other real estate brokerages that do that. The Airbnb, VRBO might be a little less. Now,
It
I
might, but it's also extremely well documented.
I was going to say it's,
Yeah.
so, and
The records are going to be there if you're using
and-
one of those systems.
And I think that the companies are actually getting better. I know we recently received an email from somebody with Expedia saying that they're our representative if we have questions on the Expedia platform. So,
Mhm.
I do think that the companies are kind of coming along.
Just to finish off on that thought, if by number of days, if we could try to do some gray extrapolation to at least try to say what we think is
Mm.
long-term versus short-term. So I think it
Mhm.
will be important for this committee to understand the revenue numbers broken down by the two. Because if we decide to make changes, we don't want those changes to end up resulting in a shortfall for your
Absolutely,
budget.
Right.
absolutely.
Now,
Absolutely.
I
Yeah,
know
it's
we
a good one.
looked at
Remember
the GRRT and it was up, wasn't it, at like over 700,000 last year?
It was high. I think we set the budget for 23 at 7.
So I think so is it about 700, give or take? Again, this is without me looking at the actual report. We can provide the actual number, but that's up. I mean, when I've been here for 5 years. When I started, it was closer to 5.
Mhm.
So it is definitely up. I think it, when COVID hit and everything shut down, we were scared to death that our revenues were just going to drop off. But I think because international travel was canceled and people were more comfortable maybe renting a house at the beach where you can be outdoors and not be,
Yeah.
we actually saw a real increase
Yeah.
in
Oh, there's been a huge increase.
visitation.
As an owner, I can tell you there's been a huge
Yes.
increase. And
Yeah.
actually, the increase has been almost more in the off season than in the summer.
Is that so?
And that's really common. This is something that I've had to talk about with Missoula, Montana, and a lot of places, especially in the Mountain West, where everyone was looking for a beautiful place like 2 hours from their house. Well, it was Delaware, right? And so, we saw that also, in mountain towns out in Washington and Idaho and stuff. And the other big thing is exactly what you're pointing to, is places that used to have a high season and a low season. Well, the highs are getting higher and the lows are getting higher as well, that you're actually getting a little bit more of a kind of flattening. I think part of that is COVID related, and part of that is just people are shifting kind of where they want to travel right now. So that you're definitely not alone in that. And I think it's been a real struggle for a lot of communities that are almost by mindset that, okay, Memorial Day, all right, now it's tourist season. Well, now it's maybe that's starting earlier, ending later. And that also has shifts, I think, for the local economy, for rentals and the timing of those. So you're not alone in that, in trying to maybe reimagine what tourism seasonality is in your community. Yeah.
And we've seen the shoulder seasons expand, and you mentioned the festivals. We've seen shoulder seasons expand, and it's, it's festivals, it's the bike trails, birding, where it's no longer really the only really slow time we have here is really January.
Yes.
It's like Christmas,
Right after Christmas.
and then everybody,
Best time to rent a house.
yes.
Cheapies. But
Hey,
yeah,
guys, I just want to announce I have to jump off the call now, but thank you, Carolyn, for
Yeah.
chairing the meeting, and thank you particularly, Jeffrey, for your involvement and participation thus far. Very, very helpful.
Thank you.
Enjoy, everybody.
Thanks, Cleo.
Okay.
Guys, do you have anything else you want to say before I call someone in the audience?
Yeah, just a follow-up question for Jeffrey. You mentioned that you had looked at a historic town in Louisiana. I don't know how Lewis compares to that town, but I was wondering if you could address or speak to the historic nature of that town and maybe how it compares to Lewis, and how, if short-term rentals at all affect that character and that charm that so many people are, living here and visiting for.
Yeah. So the town that I worked with is a town called Mandeville. It is right on the other side of the Pontchartrain Causeway, if you've ever been to Louisiana. It was the kind of getaway town from New Orleans. So it was the place that the old sugar barons would go when New Orleans got too hot, because it's right on the lake and you get these beautiful lake breezes. And they built a lot of mansions. They built a lot of, not quite mansions, but very impressive historic buildings around the beginning of the 20th century. And it's a lovely little community, and it's become a little bit more of a bedroom to retirement community, especially in the historic nature, because it's just a pleasant place to be, and they've got their own Rails to Trails project, and it's lovely. So one of their big concerns was around this expectation that this neighborhood, the historic neighborhood, was residential in character, was a kind of peaceful, quiet, lovely place, and they didn't want, in their words, a lot of people coming and going, and they were very concerned about that. They were very concerned about parties, but mostly I think their concern was about maintaining this expectation that they had bought into when they bought their homes or inherited their homes or moved to there, that this was a nice, quiet, beautiful neighborhood. And at the same time, the city government looked at these huge mansions that are right on the lake, absolutely gorgeous, huge live oaks. And they had been hearing from developers or business people that these were very, very attractive homes from an economic development side, because lots of people want to have their beautiful southern wedding at this beautiful home right on the lake. And so they wanted a system to balance those things, because they recognized that they were in a town that they had a few bed and breakfasts, no hotels, no motels, very few venues that they wanted. Yes. Sorry. And so they wanted to balance these things. They wanted to give some people the opportunity to basically start a small business that would be both a kind of quasi bed and breakfast, but also a place where weddings could happen, with this idea that they didn't, the residents didn't want people coming and going. Well, wedding is going to bring a lot of people to these places. So they developed a system. They used conditional use in order to make sure that places had plans for parking, plans for how to do some of these special events, and noise monitors and all these things, while also, in residential neighborhoods, making it, they didn't ban it. They actually said you can still do it, but it's a primary residence only. So if it's your own house in your own neighborhood, the thinking is there's a lot of built-in accountability, and you're probably not going to get too crazy, because then your neighbors are going to tell you when you come back Tuesday morning. And so that became their system. I will say, in getting to that system, there was a lot of debate about what what they were trying to protect. There were people who said, the only thing we care about are the buildings. We want to make sure that this looks like a store. We don't want people tearing anything down. We don't want people adding anything. And, people push back on that internally, being, if we preserve all the buildings, but no one lives there, is that a good outcome? Right? That preserves the character of the neighborhood. If you go there, it'll look the same, but is that the same? And so there was a lot of back and forth around what is character? What were they trying to preserve? And that led them to the regulatory choices that they made.
Good,
Oh, thank you.
good. Thank you. I don't know your name, sir, but if you'd come to the microphone if you've got a question.
Are you taking public comments?
I will always take public comments, sir.
My name's Scott Kuiper, 107 Anglers Road, 106 Anglers Road. Had beach properties, raised my kids on Pilot Town, 502 Pilot Town. And I currently own and have owned a hotel on the beach since January '94. Thanks for your time. I was on the Commercial Architectural Review Committee for a long time. I know it's a lot of extra work. Really appreciate it. Just a couple of comments, and I'll run through them, and they're not in very good order because I was taking notes. One, Lewis does not suffer from recessionary pressures. Okay, we never do. I've lived through a bunch of them. Our real estate did not collapse in 06, 08. I personally lost millions of dollars, but that's because I'm an investor. And that money all came back if you didn't panic. Lewis is literally recession proof and has been for probably 35, 40 years at least. So I don't think a collapse in real estate prices is going to cost anybody anything. If you dramatically overpaid for your property, well, welcome to the rest of the country. The other thing too is that I really encourage you to come at this from a parking point of view. That's a really great tool, and we've definitely talked about it a little bit. But one of the fundamental issues we have it now across from our hotel is the town rezoned residential. They rezoned commercial, non-conforming residential to commercial without even asking the owner of the property. So that's in the past now. You can't change that, and it should have remained commercial, in my opinion. It's on the docks, it's where all the activity is, but it became commercial or it became residential. But in fact, they built all Airbnbs in there, and they're all built by a local developer, a local realtor. That's what she does. They have 5 to 7 bedrooms with 2 parking spaces, and that's the other thing too is that and I've had an Airbnb in Florida, and where our Airbnb was, we thought was very appropriate because we had 6 parking spaces for 3 bedrooms, 2 small units. We didn't impose on anybody. Our neighbors didn't even notice we were there. And none of our neighbors were Airbnb. It was just us. But again, we had all that parking, and I had my daughter living there, and she, was all on top of it. And so I'm not opposed to Airbnb under certain conditions. But you guys are talking about them like they're not businesses, and they are absolutely businesses. And this isn't because I'm in a hotel. I've been the #1 rated hotel since 1994. I don't need any more business. I turn it down all the time. I like Airbnbs. I like the democracy of Airbnbs. But these guys are building essentially little rental houses. They've got 5 to 7 bedrooms with 2 parking spaces. They're just following the code. The code is wrong. We've kind of destroyed the beach by allowing wealthy people to essentially turn their front yards into parking lots, thus taking out the public parking that we all pay for. We used to just be able to pull down and, no offense, I don't know if you've done it, but some of these people are my really good friends.
We followed the rules.
And, pardon me?
I said, no, we followed the rules.
And wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate that. But it's never been enforced either. So I don't really even blame the people. It's like why the city didn't enforce this. And you can get into the politics. I have disagreed with Ted Becker, who I've known for decades on this. And he's like, oh, you can't do anything about that. I'm like, well, sure you can. You can enforce the code. Or you could increase the fact that if you're going to build a 7-bedroom house, you clearly are going to need more than 2 parking spaces.
Well, that's kind of why we're here.
And that's great. And so I just wanted to throw that out. And sorry, I tend to speak a little forcefully. I don't mean it that way.
To that end, I will point out Atlantic City. One of the things that they obviously were very concerned about in a lot of their city was parking. And they're doing some radical things that are pretty interesting. They have a city-owned garage that I think is attached to one of the convention centers or something. And they're saying, we're going to do a parking pass system, but we're also going to encourage short-term rentals to have basically kind of overflow in the city-owned garage as a way to, basically make sure that parking is moved off the streets and is not overwhelming the streets, but also still allowing people to come down in their cars because there's not as much transit. So you can get kind of creative depending on some of your other assets or some of your other things. So can be a way of thinking creatively too, not just phasing things.
That's appreciated. And I think Lewis is finally starting to do that. That's another thing too, that many of us have tried to persuade them for decades under Jim Ford, under Dr. Adams, under way back even to Al, to create a public parking facility. But as we all know too, once you create more parking, more people come.
You never have enough.
You never have enough.
You never have enough.
I really think we have some really good examples in Europe and some other smaller communities where Airbnb has destroyed the community and where people don't recognize anyone anymore. Anne-Marie's not here, but I've been on the phone with her many times and she's super helpful. But we already have a major issue here because we have essentially a huge hotel next to us that's 3 times our size. And that's all they do is rent. They're not homes. They're not homes. And if they come down here for 2 weeks out of the year because they happen to own a place at the beach, that's not a home. That's not a second home.
Well, that's why we're sitting here and that's why we're taking it all in and that's why we're going after it.
Well, and the only other thing I want to say is I really encourage you to encourage the town, because I know how it is being on a recommending committee. It's very frustrating sometimes, these great ideas, but it's hard to get them done sometimes once they get up to the council.
I don't know about that. I'm on council. I think we can get some things done.
Great. Well, that's great. But then you also know what I'm talking about. And then the other thing is we need some people that understand the internet. And I mean, like really deeply understand it, because this voluntary thing is a joke. As far as gross receipts or whatever they're calling it now, and is a joke if you don't have some sort of enforcement mechanism. And do you really want to get in that business? That's a legitimate question. I personally would probably outlaw Airbnbs in the city of Lewis because we don't want to be Rehoboth. We don't want to be Dewey Beach. And I know for some people that's a bummer, but I've had Airbnbs in Lewis, but I just don't see how it doesn't destroy the community. I think it already has. And I think you'll meet a lot of people like me that have moved out of town because we don't want to live here anymore. We don't want to have to argue with people about parking on our lawns. It's not why we live in Lewis. So.
Understood. Thank you very much. Anybody else out there want to say something?
I just have a question.
Sure. Introduce yourself. Not everybody knows you.
Aaron Mushrush, Cape Gazette. Thank you. So a couple of great points, and actually my questions were being answered from the committee members. I really like the discussion. My question is, has there been any talks with bringing on possibly someone from the BPW to talk about the strain in the utilities? I noticed that there was a discussion about there being an uptick in short-term rentals, and BPW President Tom Panetta actually in his pitch for ARPA funding said that a lot of the damage done to the BPW utility systems was a direct result from COVID. And I was just wondering if there is, I know it's tough to quantify these things, but I was wondering if there was any talk of possibly bringing in BPW and also anyone from the Lewis Police Department or speaking with DelDOT to try to see what the influx of people does to the utilities and what it does to our traffic and our public safety.
Great question, Aaron. And recognizing that we're at the beginning of this, your perfect timing of telling us that is exactly something that we'll look into. So any other ideas you have, please feel free to just let me know.
That was good.
Thank you. I do believe that is it. The biggest question was differentiating the different districts. But I think that there was a really good discussion on that. And Jeffrey brought up some good points that was brought up in other towns and other cities as well. So that was kind of my question was really the strain. Oh, I guess I do have another one. Is there a going to be possibly a limit for how often you can rent out your primary residence to consider it a domicile for elections? Or is there going to be a limit for how often you can rent out your primary residence in terms of short-term rentals?
Listen to,
That's a big one.
Sorry.
oh, you mean that?
Yeah. I think if it, in my opinion, I think if we were to write codes, that should be part of the code that that's been addressed in Rehoboth. It's been addressed in other small towns. It really is up to the commissioners and the mayor to figure out who would be allowed to do that kind of, that's a tough one. That has to be addressed like with you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I love that that's much of a question for Lewis. And, Lewis, if you're not a primary resident, you can't.
You
vote
don't-
You
anyway.
can't, yeah, you
We
can't.
don't even have a vote to start with,
No.
so.
But it's brought up quite often.
It is brought up quite frequently.
Yes, that's what I remember.
So you thought you'd just try one more time, right, Aaron?
So I can't explain how my mind works. It just pops in. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. We appreciate it. Sure, Kim.
Kim Avazian, 312 Pilot Town Road. I actually would like to address Jeffrey on this
Sure,
question.
please do.
If I may. The beach has its own characteristics. I live in the historic district.
Mhm.
And one thing that you talked about Mandeville, Louisiana, and the beautiful mansions and et cetera. We don't have so much mansions, but we have houses that years ago were built right next to each other. There might be a 3-foot walkway between a set of houses. I'm 8 feet away from the house next to me. Noise.
Mhm.
Noise is the problem, one of the problems, one of many problems. So when you have done your research all around the country, is there a distinction between, the houses that are spread out, those types of districts, Newport, whatever, versus a tiny little town that has houses cheek to jowl? And
Yeah.
short-term rentals in those locations?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are certain places I've worked with whole counties, and often in counties there are very rural areas, and in the rural areas they go. I mean, if you got a noise complaint from your neighbor and you live on a farm, you're blowing something up. I mean, who knows what you're doing, right? In tighter neighborhoods, again, you can get more specific, and so oftentimes you can lean on zoning. So if the historic district has its own zone, then you can basically say, okay, we know what the fabric is in this area, and it's already bounded by the historic district, or it's already bounded by, the Main Street commercial zone, or whatever it's called. And there are oftentimes you have different rules around that. Noise can be a little tricky only because you get into issues of measurement. So is it measured from the front door of the person who's complaining? Is it measured from the street? Is it a sustained noise? Is it a high point? It can get a little tricky, and we run into that here in New Orleans just with live music. People play their horns all the time. But in general, you can always be more specific to account for the built environment. So if you know there's a place where things are built very close, or they're townhomes, or they're almost essentially townhomes, you have sometimes different requirements in terms of say occupancy, right? You want to reduce the number of people who can kind of jam into some of those places, and you hope that would reduce the level of noise. You can do things with all the way to noise monitors. There are some towns, and these are especially in Florida, that say in this zone, when you get your permit, you need to get a noise monitor that plugs into the wall and sends a text alert to the host saying that the noise is too loud, right? It doesn't even require the neighbor to call it in. So you can go kind of anywhere in between those things, recognizing that, something like a day limit doesn't have a lot of matter to noise, right? You could have one day where just people go crazy, and that's going to be very disruptive to you. Certainly the number of people and just the built environment are going to be the best ways to make sure that you're being very specific about the expectations for that. And then also enforcement. When you have a real noise issue and you call it in, you want to see something happen there. And I think that's where often the greater frustration lies. It's not even the level of noise sometimes, it's just the idea that there's no, it's hard to get a hold of someone who can like tamp this down. And I know that can lead to a lot of, excuse me, frustrations with neighbors of just the idea that just like, it's just this constant thing with no resolution, right?
Right, well, it's certainly been, I've heard through the grapevine, people trying to call the local police and complain about noise and get no response from them.
Yes. So a very common thing in ordinances today would be a local contact person, which is someone who is responsible 24/7 to respond to issues. And then if they do not respond in a satisfactory manner or don't do it in a certain amount of time, for example, then that's a real violation. And if they rack up a series of those violations, usually it's 3, it's kind of a 3 strikes and you're out, then their permit is pulled, right? And that's to encourage people to take responsibility about their property and be responsive to neighbors' complaints. So that's becoming very, very common. And it's a way to, really emphasize that this is part of a neighborhood often. And so there's going to be a greater expectation that hosts will vet their guests and make sure that the guests are operating or being respectful. And if they don't do that, then there's a real penalty. They lose their permit, they lose their ability to make money.
You can cover that with like an ordinance officer,
Mhm.
but that would have to be addressed with budgeting in the city of Lewis.
That's correct.
But it's done. I live in a community somewhere else outside of Lewis, and we do have an ordinance officer, and it works. It does. It's a 24/7 number. You can call about trash, you can call about noise, and then it's all about fines after that. And every time the ordinance officer has to come out and they don't comply, there's a fine. And you'll see it does slow down the grievances on the noise and the trash or whatever it is. But an ordinance officer is something we can look into.
Is that somebody hired by the city?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, well, thank you all.
Thanks, Lee. Yes.
I'm Adrienne Gallagher. I'm a longtime resident of downtown Lewis, and I'm also a realtor and property manager with Gallagher Realty. I've lived downtown for 30 years. I love it. Raised both my kids here, and I've also been on the other side dealing with rental people. So I believe I offer quite a bit of information and experience. I do, agree with certain things that are being said, and I also have some issues with others. I think Airbnb and what we do are 2 vastly different things. I believe Airbnb tends to be more of a nightly situation where you go for 1 night, maybe 2 nights. There are certainly Airbnbs that are longer stays. Our stays are always a 3-night minimum. Usually there's 7-night minimums, especially during the summertime. And I think the people that come here for a week take a great value in this town. I've got people that have been coming back here for 30 years and they feel like their rental house is their second home, So they treat it well, they treat the town well, they spend a ton of money here. And a lot of them turn into full-time residents. They end up buying properties here and, live here full-time at some point. So I think we need to back off a little bit of just completely getting rid of them and maybe go ahead and do some enforcement of some permitting issues that you all need to come up with. Anne Marie and I have talked for years about this. I feel that trash is always a big problem for us. I've always encouraged the city to give 2 trash cans. Why not? You're paying for them, give them 2 trash cans. If you had twice a week pickup that started Memorial Day through Labor Day, that would help a lot. Parking, I agree, is a big factor. I live on McPhee Street. I have a small driveway, but when it gets busy in the summertime, I have to park down the street. Big deal, get over it. But there are people that do not have a driveway. So why aren't you guys giving them a dedicated spot? I've got a house on Mulberry Street that has no off-street parking. If they had one dedicated spot on that street, and I believe Rehoboth does the same thing. I was down, worked there for several years. I'm not a huge fan of parking permits, but I think that would solve most of your issues. Give your residents, permits, give them hang tags to give out to their resident, guests or renters. And I think that would help. I also agree that, your permitting as far as building, if you're only requiring people to have 2 parking spots, but a 7-bedroom house, that's a bigger issue that needs to start in a different location than rentals. I also have a little bit of confusion on noise complaints. Everybody has my number. I don't get calls. If I did, we would certainly address it. I did have a particularly not nice situation where someone called me because kids were playing Marco Polo in a pool next door at 6 o'clock at night. And that was her noise complaint. So I think if you had some kind of noise ordinance, what does that mean? Rehoboth has always had one. And they, Dewey would walk around with their little sound meter. And if you were going over it, then we would get a call that there was a noise problem. I don't have a problem with that. I do have a problem with overreaching comments and people that don't understand that this is a resort town. Yes, we live here full time, but we also are here because of that beach that's in down there for most of us. I have a question on how much money has been raised in tax. What are you guys getting from this gross rental receipts tax? I know what we're contributing, but you've got many towns or many people in town that are renting their property. I'd be curious to see what that is. And like Tanya said, I think we need to see an accounting of that. How much money is coming into this town? How much is really being spent on rentals? Because I have one rental on my street, but during the summertime, all of my neighbors have their friends down, their family down. So we're using just as much of the city services as that rental house. I have a question on hotels. I know that they pay an 8% tax to the state. Are they also paying your gross rental receipt tax in town? Yeah. Okay. So, should we be looking at that? Should we also, be taxing them? They are also in the business in the city. Long-term versus short-term rentals. Currently, you cannot find an inexpensive long-term rental property in the city limits. An affordable rental is in the $2,000 to $2,500 range. So those folks that are paying that, in a lot of cases, those owners are making more money than my Ocean House condos are making in a year. So I absolutely believe they should pay the same amount in licensing fees, and I think they should be collecting the same amount in tax. They're doing the same amount of business, if not more, than your short-term folks are in some cases, and actually in probably 25% of the cases. And then I also would like to remind you that 2020 and 2021 were extraordinarily unusual years. Our numbers were up exponentially. So be careful when you think that that is going to continue. We are already seeing a downturn in the rental market. It's not just in Lewis, it's in Rehoboth, it's in Dewey, it's in Bethany. And I've talked to other rental managers and other people that are in the business. People that can go across, to Europe now are doing it. They're going other places. So I think you need to look a little bit further than just the past couple of years. And that's kind of all mine.
Well, that's why I asked you to come.
You have any questions for me?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
One comment for the committee. I think we need to get real specific with language here. So Airbnb is a business. It is a website that people advertise their properties on. It's being used as a term here. I think it's being used as a catch-all and probably for more than just that site. So we need to, right, there's also VRBO.
Yep.
Right. And then there are realtors.
Yes.
Right. So we need to be real specific here. So just like for your comments, I love them, but you use that overarching term, we should ban Airbnbs. I don't really know what you mean by that. Right. So we need to get people to be really specific about what they're talking
Yeah, I think
about.
short-term rental is,
It's a whole different,
short-term rental would be the term I think is mostly
that's where we're
widely
going.
used.
Yeah, that's the term we're
Yeah,
gonna
I think
stick
we
with.
all tend to fall back to Airbnb or VRBO, which I think Airbnb owns the VRBO now.
I know, but the
No,
concept
HomeAway
behind
does.
this meeting is the
HomeAway?
short-term rentals.
Right, right.
And we're gonna stay with that
But,
concept.
but I do agree with what you're saying and
Tanya.
what Adrian was saying. We have to be mindful because we had 2 extraordinary years following this epidemic or pandemic that we had. And I feel like it isn't going to last because all the roads are leading to outside our country now. We can go so many different places. And I do think that we have to take in and listen to everyone that is here and try to find that balance. And that's what we're doing. And I do agree that I see that the rentals are starting to slip. They're starting to go down. People are not wanting to be in the local areas as much as traveling now. But then we have another thing that's coming, which is gas. Now people are going to say, well, now maybe I better go back to that beach, from DC instead of going to Italy. I don't know the answer because it's so unknown right now. This is something we've never seen. We do have to have some type of rules and I do agree with everyone that's in this room. We all have an issue that has to be addressed at some point so we don't lose what we have.
I understand.
Yeah.
What I'd like to do at this particular point is, I'd like to bring us back to the short-term rental concept. I want to bring us back to what we've learned today and recognizing that it covers every facet of what we're going to try to do here. But by the same token, we need to stay focused. And Jeffrey, thank you a million. I really appreciate your
Absolutely.
efforts. We'll be talking. But at this point, I want to close this out. Sir, do you have something you want to say right away?
Real quick, just from a public point of view, like coming from the newspapers, and I totally get the whole short-term rental thing, but I think it's a little confusing when you read about it because the first thing a friend of mine asked me, he goes, well, you're in the short-term rental business. And that's absolutely correct. Now I have a 2-night minimum in season, but off season I don't. So I rent lots of rooms for 1 night or 2 nights. So I'm in the short-term rental business. But of course, I'm a hotel subject to an incredible array of regulations and other taxes, it's not the same. And I think we are trying to differentiate. And when I say Airbnb, I am using it as like Kleenex, I do need tissue. But I do think from the outside, it's a little hard to, so I'm with you 100%. I'm just not quite sure we're quite there.
Yeah, well, when we started this, we started with what we considered to be short-term rental. We specifically stated the issues that we would address. We're not going to deviate from that. This is a great meeting. I appreciate everybody's time and effort. We will not deviate from what our objective was and why we came here. Okay, so at this point, what I'd like you to do is we said we would set up a meeting every 2 weeks. So take a look at your calendar. Let's see what we can put down. And Jeffrey, we will get back to you because obviously from where I'm sitting, we're going to pull you in and see how we can start your input with this group, whether we bring you in physically and you be here so that we can get this off on the right foot. I think probably where I'm going to go. But right now, I'll come up with the time and let's see how it sits with your time as well. If I go 2 weeks out, I'm in, where am I? 28.
We have set up June 28th.
Oh,
10
good.
a.m. is our next meeting, and then after that would be July 12th.
Good. Yes, we did. We already have it. Everybody still have that?
I do. I will have a hard stop at 11 that day, but that's not.
That's okay. As long as you're here and if ever you have to do Zoom, just stay.
Yes, I will be in Texas. that
Stay
day, so
close with
I'll be
us
Zoom.
so that we can keep your input, okay? We had the 28th, Jeffrey, at 10. Is that good for you?
Yeah, it should be fine for me.
Okay, everyone else? Okay, at this particular point, I'm going to close this meeting. I think that we have covered a lot. I'm very happy from where we are. When I come back to the next meeting, I will give you some of what I think we ended up with, but also I think I'm going to have Jeffrey in. So if no one else has anything else, I'd like to close this meeting. Thank you. I appreciate your time and energies.
Take care, everybody.
Take care, Jeffrey. I'll talk to you.
Great.